In May 1919, 6 months after the end of the Great War in Europe, a French train departed from Berlin, carrying the German delegation to the Paris Peace Conference. As the train came into France and passed through the war-torn countryside, it slowed to a deliberate crawl.
The German delegation had to sit there and watch as unfolding around them was this unbelievably devastated landscape in which there were still bodies visible, in which this catastrophe of war had been waged over for 4 years, killing millions.
There was a sense that Europe had done something probably that could not be repaired to itself, and there was a casting around for people to blame, and the obvious country to blame was Germany.
But for the winners of the war, punishing Germany was just one of their tasks. They also hoped to create something new, a future without such wars.
From the ordinary soldier to the biggest ruler in the land, what everybody knew was they had to figure out a way to make sure that something like World War I didn't happen again.
The victors decided to meet in Paris to begin the daunting task of rebuilding the world and making a lasting peace settlement with Germany. In a clash of personalities and agendas, facing unimaginable circumstances, the world's leaders met for 6 months to try to deliver that promise. But just a few years later, their plan for peace would unravel, catapulting the world toward the very tragedy they had wanted to prevent. Was it their fault, or was it inevitable?
Most actions have unintended consequences. Things which are done for very good reasons, as it seemed at the time, can often have huge, unforeseen and unintended and unwanted consequences later.
In January 1919, although gravely scarred by the First World War, Paris was reviving. It was the symbol of hope, and thousands came for the Great Peace Conference, filling the city with excitement and promise. After 4 years, this monstrous war was finally over. But outside of Paris was a sobering reality. Europe was shattered, changed forever. The war had been horrific and unparalleled in scope and scale.
When 1914 comes and the war breaks out, the countries find out that they can wage a war that is much larger and much better supplied and much bloodier than any war previously. Once they began to understand that this was different, they didn't understand how you won this new kind of war. And learning that lesson cost you millions of men.
When Germany finally realized it could no longer fight and asked the Allies for an armistice, over 15 million soldiers and civilians were dead and countless wounded. Much of France had been decimated by German armies. And the rest of Europe was in turmoil. The 3 great empires that had dominated the continent had evaporated overnight: the Ottoman Empire, Austria-Hungary, and Tsarist Russia, leaving anarchy and the threat of widespread revolution in their wakes.
What was also happening was just sheer physical collapse and decay. I mean, a lot of the transportation systems weren't running because there was no fuel for the railways, there was no money to buy the fuel. And what you were getting in a number of most prosperous cities of the world is you were getting starvation.
The organizations that had run the world for the last century have disappeared. And so there is no one else but those men in Paris to make decisions about how the world's going to run in the future.
And that future had to be built nearly from scratch. On January 18th, the peace conference officially opened at the offices of the French Foreign Ministry on the Quai d'Orsay. Delegates from around the world, representing over 30 victorious countries, gathered to discuss the terms of the German peace treaty with each other first. They would send for the German delegation to join them later. Hundreds of committees began meeting and negotiating in a process that was cumbersome and inefficient. In a pragmatic move, the leaders of the three most powerful countries at the conference took control: U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, and British Prime Minister David Lloyd George.
David Lloyd George was an extraordinary self-made man, and he got to where he got by sheer force of personality and by sheer intelligence, and by being a very, very good politician, and in many ways a very great administrator.
He had a very quick mind and charming. I mean, you could charm the birds out of the trees, and you charm many birds out of many trees. So he's a brilliant negotiator, brilliantly skilled at getting people to sit down and agree around a table. Now, the problem was that sometimes when they agreed, they would agree because he would have promised one thing to one person, one thing to another, and the hope was they would never meet.
As a measure of his political skill, Lloyd George had been re-elected Prime Minister just before the conference as part of a coalition between Britain's Liberal and Conservative parties. This forced him to walk a delicate line when representing Britain's point of view at the peace conference, especially toward Germany. But unanimously, Britain wanted naval supremacy and to go back to running its empire. France, who'd suffered the greatest losses and whose land and people were among the most ravaged by the war, wanted security to guarantee protection against German attack. And Georges Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister, was the embodiment of this. The oldest of the three at age 77, he had suffered through 2 German invasions of France in 40 years, first in 1871 and then again in 1914.
And it is said that when he died, he left orders that he should be buried standing up and facing the German frontier.
Clemenceau's an absolutely tough negotiator, and he believed that what France had to do was to survive. And he was aware that France had only won the war because it had allies.
One crucial ally had been the United States. Having come late to the war, the Americans had not suffered the same losses as the Europeans, but had saved the day with men and resources when the British and French were at their end. Now, the man who had kept the U.S. out of the fighting for nearly 3 years, American President Woodrow Wilson, landed confidently in Europe, armed with a 14-point plan for peace.
Wilson is coming to Europe to solve Europe's problems. He's talking about national self-determination, talking about democracy, making the world safe for democracy. Partly on the basis that he believed that if you made the world safe for democracy, democracy would make the world a safer place. So he's got a vision of a post-war world. When he arrives in Europe, all his sort of own beliefs are buoyed up by the fact that he gets this incredible welcome. In Paris, they throw flowers in front of his carriage as he drives through. It's like Christ coming into Jerusalem. And Wilson takes this as being an endorsement of his policies. And that wasn't necessarily what the people cheering meant, but that was what Wilson took from it.
He was also a very difficult man. His father had been a Presbyterian minister, and there was something of an evangelical about Woodrow Wilson, a conviction that he was right. And that, of course, helped him to do great things, but it also made him rather dangerous. And if he was crossed, if someone disagreed with him, he tended to say that that person is wrong and evil.
Both Clemenceau and David Lloyd George, if you had taken them aside and asked them what they thought of Wilson, they would have told you they thought he was an idiot, that he was supercilious, that he was pompous, that he was arrogant, that the United States had come late to the party and had suffered very little, and that here was Wilson holding himself up as the man who was going to reorganize the world.
And Wilson arrived planning to do just that. He insisted that they start the treaty negotiations with his plan for an unprecedented international organization to keep the peace, the League of Nations. Most people at the conference were enthusiastic for this new approach to diplomacy.
They had seen what 4 years of war had done. They were horrified at the thought that something like that would ever happen again. And so I think there was a very widespread public feeling that we can't go on like this, that humanity can't go on like this, that we must build institutions where nations can settle their disputes peacefully, and that if you get aggressor nations, you can have collective action against those nations.
Wilson was aware that the treaty would make mistakes, and for him the great safety net was the League of Nations. It would put right the things which they hadn't got right, working under such pressure as they were working at the time.
And these pressures were all around them. Hundreds of people had come to Paris out of the crumbled empires of Central Europe and the Middle East. Poles, Czechs, Kurds, Ukrainians, and many others wanted recognition for their causes, their ethnic and national identities, or help settling territorial disputes. The magnitude of this task made the League of Nations ever more crucial. For the first time in history, nations of the world would respond together to international conflicts, mediating when passions flared in order to prevent war.
Lloyd George and Clemenceau sort of think it's cute. I mean, that's sort of a flip way of putting it, but they sort of think that Wilson is both highly optimistic and naive in his belief in this.
Despite their skepticism, Lloyd George and Clemenceau backed Wilson, hoping for concessions from him later in exchange. On February 14, 1919, after only 2 weeks of discussion, the conference agreed to form the League of Nations and to make it the first part of the treaty with Germany. The Big Three took a break from the negotiations, satisfied with their accomplishments so far, and went home to drum up public support for the League. One month later, in March, Wilson, Lloyd George, and Clemenceau reunited in Paris. But even with visions of a new diplomacy lingering in the air, the people of Europe were still calling for German blood. And adding to the pressure, a harsh winter had fueled a ravenous flu epidemic, and millions were dying.
People in Britain and the United States and France were saying, well, what are they doing all the time? You know, why can't they draw up some peace terms and get on with it? There was a feeling that this is all taking too long. We're delaying too long. The world was not getting any better. There were more demonstrations, more riots, more evidence of troubles from all over the world. If we don't get a peace very soon, who knows what's going to happen? And so that added to the pressure on the peacemakers.
Working tirelessly in Wilson's study and brushing aside petitions from the hundreds seeking audience with them, the Big Three finally turned to the question of what to do with Germany.
And they had a whole series of issues to deal with Germany. What were the new frontiers of Germany going to be? What was Germany's military strength going to be allowed to be? How was the new Germany going to be incorporated into the new international structures of international affairs? Would, for example, it be allowed to join the League of Nations? What was Germany going to have to pay for the cost of the war?
You can understand it. I mean, people were saying in 1919, well, who did all this? And the idea that it was just all a mistake, it was not something that people could get their heads around. And so what they were saying was someone did it, someone ought to pay. But you also have this issue of how do you prevent Germany from becoming powerful again.
Before the Great War, Germany had been an overbearing giant forged from smaller countries after defeating France in 1871.
Germany was simply too powerful a country to fit comfortably in Central Europe. The political organization of Europe had been unbalanced by the presence of Germany. World War I was largely about that imbalance. The Germans attempting to break out of the straitjacket that they felt was surrounding them because of the way Europe worked.
Clemenceau and the French favored a drastic solution: break Germany up again into its smaller parts. But Lloyd George and Wilson opposed this, wanting to keep Germany intact as a bulwark against a new threat: the Russians. A vital ally during the war, Russia had collapsed in 1917 and was now led by Vladimir Lenin and his Bolshevik Party. Lenin was calling for a worldwide communist revolution.
The spectre of Bolshevism was a huge threat to the peace conference. It's an issue which nobody really defined very clearly, but they thought about it in terms of anarchy, chaos, the collapse of order.
They are terrified of a Bolshevik wave sweeping out of the steppes of Russia. But they're also terrified of a resurgent Germany. And they can't figure out a way to deal with both effectively.
Fear of the Bolsheviks would convince the Allies to keep Germany whole, but they still had to find a way to protect France. The Big Three agreed that the German military must be dismantled and that the Germans should pay reparations. But Clemenceau also wanted land along Germany's border with France, so they could have a buffer against invasion and chip away at Germany's size. Wilson and Lloyd George balked at the idea, fearing it could fuel instability.
And so both Wilson and Lloyd George said, we are not going to see land taken from Germany. It will only lead to the Germans, for a generation or more, wanting it back. It will simply poison international relations.
To break the deadlock over French insecurity, Lloyd George proposed that Britain and the US offer a guarantee that they would defend France against a future German attack. Clemenceau was delighted. But there was a catch. The British guarantee would only become active if the US signed on too.
Lloyd George had slipped that one word only in just before the guarantee treaty was being signed. Clemenceau hadn't noticed this being slipped into the wording of the treaty, had signed anyway. Clemenceau felt he'd been cheated.
Later, Britain would be able to use Lloyd George's loophole to back away from their promise, leaving France vulnerable. As summer approached, the Big Three would continue to horse trade over the German peace terms, arguing and compromising every contentious detail. Meanwhile, on the streets of Berlin, the mood was volatile. Strikes and revolution threatened the fledgling German government, which had been waiting for 6 months and was anxious to send its delegation to Paris. They'd prepared extensively for tough diplomacy, and expectations were high. But even though the German generals had capitulated and the Allies had seized their weapons at the end of the war, the German people became convinced during these months of waiting that the armistice was more of a ceasefire than a surrender.
Partly, it was the sheer physical fact that Germany itself was not occupied. And if you don't see enemy soldiers on your territory, you don't have the same sense of defeat that you might have if they're actually there billeted in your houses and marching down your streets. The German armies withdrew in good order, and they marched back into Germany, and they were greeted as a triumphal force. And so they began to foster this myth that Germany had not been defeated, and the only reason Germany had stopped fighting was because of the cowardice of the politicians at home. Much more dangerously, the myth began to include various groups in German society, and you got what came to be known as the stab in the back myth. The myth that Germany had been defeated on the home front by cowardly politicians, by socialists and communists, and by the Jews.
Finally, the Allies sent notice, and the Germans headed to Paris for what they thought would be peace negotiations.
The Germans really began to believe that whatever the treaty was going to be, it wasn't going to be too bad. They believed that they were going to go to Paris and be treated as equals by the negotiators, not as losers.
But on their long, slow train ride through the French countryside, through the blighted landscape and horrors of the war, they began to realize that they might be wrong. The German delegation was brought into a small train station and then to the second-rate Reservoir Hotel near the Paris suburb of Versailles.
The whole hotel was ringed with barbed wire and armed guards. This, it was said, so that the angry French people wouldn't, come in and beat them up. But the Germans, of course, felt they were in a sort of prison. And their luggage was all dumped in the courtyard of the hotel, and when they looked around for porters, the French said abruptly, "You carry it yourselves."
And they are sitting in the hotel, convinced the French are listening to them, which of course the French are. So they have a pianist playing very loudly on the piano all the day, or they're playing their gramophones all the day in order to confuse the French listeners.
The head of the German delegation was Count Ulrich von Brockdorff-Rantzau, the foreign minister. He was tall, distinguished, and wore a monocle, the epitome of the German aristocrat.
Brockdorff-Rantzau was not as hidebound and conservative as he looked, but very stiff-necked and very much on his dignity and very much prepared to really be tough if he possibly could, because he felt that Germany really had to negotiate very, very hard indeed.
But he would never get the chance. 1 week after their arrival, he and the German delegates were summoned to the Trianon Palace Hotel to be brought before the victorious powers and handed the completed treaty.
They were brought in and told to sit down, and Brockdorff-Rantzau said it looked like a prisoner's dock, where prisoners sit in a courtroom. And Clemenceau said, "Here you are, here are your peace terms, take them or leave them, there will be no negotiations. If you have any comments, you can submit them in writing."
And when Clemenceau reads out its major provisions with his face stony and cold and hostile, the Germans were shocked. More than they should have been, but still shocked.
Brockdorff-Rantzau had prepared 2 speeches to read in response to the Allies, one mild and one harsh.
And at that point, von Brockdorff-Rantzau decided to pull out the tougher speech, and he gave it sitting down. Now, a lot of people at the time thought that was sheer German arrogance, that he was too impolite even to stand up, although others who were there said that he was shaking so much he couldn't have stood up. It's not clear, but it left a very bad impression. It just confirmed the view that the Germans were pig-headed and stubborn and there was no point dealing with them, and read out this very defiant speech and said, you want to destroy Germany, you want Germany to cease to exist, we cannot possibly accept such terms. Got up and marched out. And as he stood on the steps outside the Trianon Palace Hotel, lit a cigarette and very sort of defiantly smoked it and walked off.
The Germans were given 2 weeks to respond to the ultimatum in writing. Back at their hotel, the delegates dove into the massive treaty, which had over 440 clauses. They literally tore it into parts so they could read it more quickly.
There was this Greek chorus of disaster unfolding in the room. We're losing all our colonies, we're losing the Navy, the Army's going to be reduced down to nothing. And because they're in private, they are not at all restrained about showing their reactions. Some of them begin weeping. Some of them begin drinking. But all of them begin to understand the sort of full measure of what they see as a disaster.
When the delegation returned home, the German public was outraged. Not only would they have to give up their colonies and most of their military, they would also, in fact, lose valuable land along their border, a French victory during the negotiations. But the most egregious clause insisted that Germany admit responsibility for the war and pay huge sums in damages to the Allies, the actual amount to be decided later.
And that was another thing the Germans resented. They had to sign a treaty in which they promised to pay reparations, but they didn't know how much they would have to pay.
The Germans had expected Wilson's influence to soften the peace agreement. But despite his idealism, Wilson still believed in retribution for sin and supported the Allies in their calls for punishment.
They based their case on 3 premises: that Germany had started a war illegally, that they'd fought the war in a harsh and illegal manner, and that they'd lost. The Germans accepted none of those 3 premises.
And when that feeling developed, it undermined the whole basis of the peace. because you make a peace based on an assumption that one side's won, the other side's lost. If you begin to feel that, in fact, the war had ended in a stalemate, then the peace in which people on the losing side had given up things came to be seen as increasingly illegitimate. And that was a very, very important shift.
Brockdorff-Rantzau and the German delegation recommended that the government refuse to sign the treaty, raising the specter of another war.
German government then asked its own high command, okay, can we fight? And the German high command said no. The terms of the armistice amounted to a surrender. We have given up all our offensive weapons. We're in no position to fight on. You have to sign.
The crisis caused the German government to collapse, and a new government was formed. They replaced Brockdorff-Rantzau and his team with a new delegation of low-level diplomats and ordered them back to Paris to sign the treaty. On June 28, 1919, 5 years to the day that an assassination in Sarajevo ignited the war, the signing ceremony began at the Palace of Versailles. Hundreds pressed into the historic Hall of Mirrors, and the world watched as the Germans quietly signed the Treaty of Versailles. Finally, Europe could move forward and begin to heal. Woodrow Wilson arrived home triumphant, but his dream quickly evaporated. Wilson, a Democrat, needed approval from 2/3 of the Republican-controlled Senate for the Treaty of Versailles to be ratified. But he refused to accept even minor changes. While trying to drum up public support, Wilson suffered a crippling stroke. And without his voice to champion it, the treaty with his League of Nations failed to pass.
Wilson, in a sense, by his own stubbornness and his refusal to compromise, ensured that the United States wouldn't sign the Treaty of Versailles, wouldn't join the League of Nations.
The United States retreated in isolation. And the three men who dominated the Paris Peace Conference and whose decisions would have the most far-reaching outcomes soon would be out of power. Woodrow Wilson's stroke left him an invalid, and his wife would run the government behind closed doors. David Lloyd George would be forced to resign from office in 1922. And Georges Clemenceau would retire after a failed bid for the presidency. But the work of the conference continued. The League of Nations struggled to assert itself as the European powers that controlled it recognized new countries out of old empires, took over colonies in Africa and Asia, and carved up the oil-rich Middle East between France and Britain. In 1919, when world leaders had gathered in Paris, they had faced enormous pressures: revolution, famine, and a shell-shocked public calling for revenge. Their plans for a lasting peace and for sternly addressing Germany would have sweeping and unintended consequences.
I think what we always have to ask ourselves when we look at the past is, what would we have done? If we had been there sitting in Paris, what would we have done differently? Could we have said to Germany, look, we'll let bygones be bygones, we won't ask you to pay any money at all, it's all been a mistake? Could we have done that and gone home to our own public opinion and said sorry about the husbands and the lovers and the children who've been killed in the war, but it was a mistake, we've got to move on? You have to ask what was possible at the time. And making peace in 1919 was very, very difficult.
The Treaty of Versailles certainly wasn't an ideal settlement, but it was probably the best that could be reached in the circumstances at that time. It wasn't without faults, it wasn't without major things which needed to be changed. But built into it were a series of safeguards, like the League of Nations, which should, had they worked properly, have changed the way in which international politics were conducted, and were seen by many people at the time as providing a safety net to make the necessary changes.
It's quite possible it might have worked, except the Depression came along. And what you get is countries withdrawing, turning inwards, thinking of themselves. What you also get is an increase in radicalism, either people moving towards communism on the left or moving towards fascism or Nazism on the right.
In 1939, France's greatest fear became real, and Germany once again marched across Europe. An impotent League of Nations could do nothing. A Second World War was followed by a Cold War. And the other great fear in the minds of the Paris peacemakers, a communist wave, did indeed challenge the West. The flawed legacy of 1919 would continue into the next century, leaving the League's successor, the United Nations, to respond.
In places like the Middle East, in places like the Balkans, and Southeast Asia, boundaries and organizations and ideas were forced on populations by the Western powers. Those impositions and the reaction to those impositions are still being untangled today and will be for the long term.
There's a real danger, I think, that very powerful nations have, and they sit there and they think, we're very powerful, and we can do what we want with the world because who's as powerful as us, and other people in the world will recognize it. But organizing human beings isn't always that easy. And dealing with religious passions, dealing with ideologies and emotions, none of it's easy. And so if the peace conference does anything, perhaps it reminds us that it's never all that easy to settle things, and you have to be prepared to accept that.